Hello everyone. So recently I found that Dogen, a pretty big well-known YouTuber, responded to my video on pitch accent, and I thought I'd make a quick video just talking about what I thought about it and try and explain my intentions with my video a bit more and then address some of the points he raised. To start off, after listening to the whole video, I did really appreciate how he responded in such a courteous and civil manner. I could tell he made an effort to try and understand the perspective of my video before giving his thoughts and stating his disagreements, which I quite admired. He definitely brought up some interesting points, some of which I plan to respond to later in the video. It's a 3-hour video, so I can't realistically respond to all the points made. I only plan to respond to some of the ones that stood out to me in particular. But before I respond to Dogen's points, I'm going to take the first part of the video to explain what my intentions were with my original video, as well as talk about what I feel I should have done differently. I still do stand by the overall arguments I made in the video, but I have come to somewhat regret the tone of the video and the way I presented my points in some parts of the video. To me, it felt like so many learners of Japanese in particular can be so obsessive sometimes, worrying about every minute detail they can find, and I believe the perceived importance of pitch accent has been inflated by this sort of obsession. My intention for making the video was simply to say you don't need to worry so much about the details if you don't want to, because getting enough input in the language and eventually getting a bit of output practice is more than enough. I do think I achieved this aim to some degree, which I could see from some of the positive comments I received, but at the same time I concede that the assertive tone and some of the overbearing expressions I used did seem to alienate and negatively provoke some of the viewers, which probably wasn't the best outcome. Spending time in online communities of Japanese learners, I get the feeling that there's an unhealthy obsession for many learners with having to sound completely native accent-wise, and there seems to be almost a sort of shame around not sounding perfect. I feel like the YouTuber Matt vs Japan had a role to play in creating this atmosphere, which is why my video featured so many of his arguments. Now, I don't want to say anything bad about Matt, because he seems like a decent guy and I really agree with most of what he says about language learning, and I know his videos have helped a lot of people, so I think he did have a positive effect overall. But at the same time, his somewhat perfectionistic and obsessive tendencies did do a lot to encourage a sort of atmosphere of having to sound perfect and a fear of mistakes, which I believe had a negative effect on many learners. I also think that many of the exaggerated arguments he made played a big part in leading many learners to believe that pitch accent is much more important than it really is. I feel as if this way of thinking dominated the discourse around pitch accent too. When I searched for pitch accent on YouTube, with very few exceptions, all that came up were videos about how important it is and how necessary it is to learn. So I wanted to create a video that would counter that and offer a different perspective which I thought wasn't being offered by anyone else. In essence, I wanted to encapsulate in one video every possible argument I could think of against pitch accent, to present a perspective from the other side, as I've never seen a video like mine arguing against the importance of pitch accent, despite the number of videos stressing and even wildly exaggerating its importance. The fact that a popular, widely known YouTuber like Dogen would respond to a video from a relatively obscure channel like mine just highlights how absent this sort of perspective that I put forth has been. Another reason I felt compelled to make the video was because of my own personal experience. The tendency towards perfectionism, which isn't confined to pitch accent, of course, affected me when I was learning, and for a long time I avoided speaking because I was frustrated and even embarrassed that I couldn't sound perfect and had a slight foreign accent. It was only after moving to Japan and having to use the language on a daily basis that I came to realize just how little things like this actually mattered, and how overinflated their importance seems to be online in learning communities. At its core, the video wasn't so much about pitch accent as it was about perfectionism and worrying about the details of a language in general. This might sound strange, but I really don't feel that strongly about pitch accent, and I really don't have a problem with anyone who promotes it, teaches it, or studies it. I've even made a video myself in the past demonstrating how to train yourself to hear it. The main message was just to not get caught up on the details, and just to have faith in the process. I wrote it almost as a personal message directed at my past self, and I thought many learners who were in a similar situation, and it seems there are quite a few, could gain value from hearing it. Although this obsession with perfection isn't limited to pitch accent, I nonetheless think a lot of the popularity and interest in pitch accent stems from it. I'm not at all saying that this is the main motivator for everyone who studies pitch accent, but I do think the fear of not sounding perfect does have some role to play in many people's decision to learn it. and I think it's partly the reason it's become as popular as it has. The mistake I made in my video is that I seem to have given the impression that anyone who studies pitch accent is obsessive and insecure about their ability. This is clearly not the case, and there are plenty of people who are doing it for enjoyment or out of interest, which I think is great. The main point I just wanted to get across in the video is that you shouldn't feel pressured to learn it just because you've been led to believe that you will sound bad when speaking, and I presented examples of people who sounded great or even native without having studied pitch, just to show that the belief that it's impossible to attain extremely natural or native sounding Japanese without studying pitch is false. I realized that I got a bit too carried away in some parts while writing the script for that video, and in attempting to provide an opposing view, as well as make it entertaining to watch, there were parts where I probably veered too heavily to the other end and came off as quite strident in the way I presented my case. If this had the effect of discouraging or demoralizing any learners who were watching, that certainly wasn't my intention at all. And being responsible for reigniting an online flame war in which people argue over the specifics of a language probably wasn't the most productive outcome, especially considering my message was you shouldn't worry so much in the first place. To put it simply, the message I was trying to convey in my video was this. If you have a genuine interest in pitch accent, or your goal is to speak standard sounding Japanese with the most accuracy possible, then go ahead, study pitch accent. But the majority of learners who learn with listening-heavy, input-based approaches will eventually acquire enough pitch accent to sound natural or native-like without the need to study it. And even if for some reason you don't reach this level, it's probably not as big a deal as you think it is. Again, Dogen's video is over 3 hours long, so I won't attempt to try responding to all the points he brought up. It occurred to me while watching the video that some of the disagreements we had probably arose from the different types of audiences we're targeting and the types of methodology our respective audiences are more likely to use. On my channel, I'm mainly targeting people who learn foreign languages specifically by getting large amounts of input from the start and who probably aren't concerned about speaking until they've formed a basic intuitive understanding of the language. My message was primarily aimed at this type of learner. Dogen, on the other hand, seems to be targeting a wider audience, which includes plenty of people who are learning more casually or with a more output-heavy approach from the start, as well as those who might be using more traditional study methods. Dogen actually appears to agree with me that after delayed output and lots of listening input over many years, most people will probably reach a level where pitch accent won't be a problem. But he suggests that many people don't want to wait that long, so studying pitch provides a way to get the benefits of sounding more natural without it taking so long. A good deal of my responses to Dogen's other points in his video could be summed up like this. You simply need more input. But Dogen does raise a valid point, and I also realize that many, if not all, casual learners will likely never reach a level where they've gotten the massive amount of input necessary to attain a natural sounding accent without having actively studied pitch accent or phonetics. Before, I would have argued that you shouldn't worry about this because you're already at a low level, so fixing pitch isn't going to have much of an effect as it will only fix one aspect of your Japanese. But after considering it more, I do think that for many casual learners or learners who use more traditional language learning methods, studying pitch accent will likely improve your accent and make you sound more comprehensible, so I have to concede this one to Dogen. For learners who are using a listening-heavy input-based approach from the start and are more focused on long-term results, however, I still don't think it's necessary for most learners to worry about pitch accent unless they really want to. In one part of the video, Dogen compares mistaking the pitch accent of a word with mistaking L and R in English, in that both are understandable to a native speaker, but it nonetheless sounds strange. I can see his reasoning here, but I think that in most cases, mistaking the R and L sounds in English holds more weight than mistaking the pitch accent of a word in Japanese. Take the example Dogen used, saying Nihongo instead of Nihongo. Although it could be technically considered a mistake in standard Japanese, I've heard plenty of native speakers from Kansai or Western Japan saying it with this pronunciation, whereas a native speaker of English wouldn't reasonably mistake the L and R sounds. Of course, it might stand out, but if you mistake the pitch, it's very likely that there do exist native speakers who say it that way, whereas the same is simply not true for mistaking L and R. Dogen makes the point that most native speakers will have a consistent accent from a specific region, and although there are some speakers who have a somewhat mixed accent, it is quite rare. I actually agree with this, and I wasn't at all trying to suggest that most native speakers don't have a consistent accent. One reason I argued that you don't need to worry about having a consistent accent is based on my own experience and observations living in other countries. During my time overseas, I've encountered many other English natives whose pronunciation has become decidedly more mixed after living abroad for many years and being exposed to many different accents during this time. On top of that, I've also met plenty of international school educated native English speakers with unplaceable accents. To me, this just reflects their international backgrounds, and they were still able to sound perfectly native and natural despite this, so why should they need to fix it? Of course, if they do have a desire to sound consistent, it's ultimately their choice, but I don't think it's anyone's place to argue that they should, or that they should feel embarrassed by this lack of consistency. Now, assuming it's possible to achieve the ability to sound extremely natural or even near native in a foreign language while having an inconsistent accent, likewise, I don't think that there's any need whatsoever to try and sound like you grew up in a specific region when you didn't. Again, if you want to, that's fine. But I only take issue with telling others that they should aim for a consistent accent, and I don't think anyone should feel pressured to. Dogen also brings up the point that even though regional natives make pitch accent mistakes, the type of mistakes you as a learner will make will be influenced by your background as a speaker of a stress-based language, and thus will be different from the types of mistakes a native makes. Again, this comes back to the point I made at the start, that if you get lots of input over a long time, you'll eventually acquire enough of the language that the majority of mistakes you make won't fall into this category. You can see this from many of the speakers in the video I used as an example in my video, Can You Really Acquire Pitch Accent?, as well as the playlist I often referenced. But also, like I mentioned before, this point mostly applies to the types of learners I'm targeting. And for more casual learners or learners using traditional methods, this doesn't apply. Another argument I often hear is that you might end up jumping around 5 different accents in the same sentence, which no native would do and will simply make it difficult to understand what you're saying. But I think this is quite exaggerated and unrealistic. From what I've seen, advanced learners who have had much exposure to the language over many years might make plenty of pitch mistakes that deviate from standard Japanese, but generally, it's not to such an extreme degree where they're constantly jumping around accents, and often their speech tends to gravitate towards a particular region. If I were to remake the video again, this is probably one point I wouldn't have included. I still think it's a valid argument, but my intention with the video was to quell any perfectionist anxieties that language learners may hold, whereas presenting the possibility that pitch accent could hurt your spoken fluency potentially has the opposite effect. That said, I should note that I was careful about the language I used here. I never said definitively it will hurt your fluency in the long term. I only suggested that there's a possibility it will, even if it's to a limited degree in most cases. Dogen countered this point by saying that yes, it will hurt your spoken fluency at first, but through practice it eventually becomes second nature. I do agree that eventually it does become more intuitive and almost second nature, but I still believe that the extra effort required while speaking doesn't go away entirely, even if it becomes a lot faster and less noticeable over time. Of course, this experience may be different for different learners. I base this mainly on personal experience and some anecdotes I've heard, and it's impossible to prove or disprove, so I hesitate to push this point too hard, but I nonetheless think there's a possibility it could have this sort of effect long term, even if that effect becomes less noticeable over time. Dogen also countered my point by saying that the same argument could be made for grammar and vocabulary, but I would counter that there's one major difference. Currently, there is no content available that allows you to acquire Japanese without this sort of study, which makes doing some study and learning words necessary to understand and pick up Japanese. Whereas pitch accent is definitely not essential or even important for learning to understand Japanese. So if we assume that both memorizing words and learning pitch accent have some sort of unwanted effect on your overall fluency, learning words is still necessary to learn and understand the language, whereas learning pitch accent isn't. In this part, I thought there were 2 good points in particular that Dogen brought up. The first was that even though natives may not care, oftentimes the person speaking will care that there's an aspect of their speech that they're mistaking without realizing, and it's not anyone else's place to tell that person whether they should or shouldn't care. I think this is a valid point, and ultimately, if you really want to speak with an entirely consistent Tokyo accent, then no one has any business telling you shouldn't. In my video, I was simply trying to say that if you're someone who feels compelled to study pitch accent for fear of being judged or sounding awful when you speak, that is, in my opinion, misguided. I was rather trying to say that you don't need to, not that you shouldn't. But I am aware that the overbearing and sometimes excessive way I presented my arguments could have obscured this message for many people. The second point was that a lot of natives actually do care, as many natives from regional areas will purposely try to hide their accent when they travel to Tokyo or other regions. This is a good point, and it's true there are many natives who try to fix their regional accents in an attempt to sound more proper or educated. But learners of Japanese don't need to worry about this until they've reached a highly advanced level. Beginner and intermediate learners don't need to worry about sounding regional, because they will inevitably sound like second language foreign speakers regardless of whether they study pitch accent, even if pitch accent might help them sound more understandable or clear at the lower levels. But yes, I do admit that if you've reached a level where you can speak naturally with a good accent, then learning pitch accent to help you sound more consistent and proper could be beneficial, only if that's your goal, of course. Overall, I enjoyed watching Dogen's video, and he did bring up some really good points in his reaction video, and I'm not trying to say any of his arguments are wrong, even if we disagree on many things. Not to mention that many of the disagreements have to do with the sort of approach I recommend with my channel, an immersion-based approach that recommends acquiring much of the language through input instead of conscious study and memorization. Ultimately, whether you study pitch accent is a personal choice, so I don't want to tell you you shouldn't, only that you don't necessarily need to. This will most likely be the last video I make about pitch accent, so if you have any questions or thoughts you want to share, leave a comment down below.